It's easier, someone once said, to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism.
But it's clear that where we can make systems of this complexity, cultural systems, economic systems, machines of this complexity, surely we could make a world that could first meet those needs I described that everyone should have, and then perhaps meet needs that people have only dreamed of, like the need for some autonomy and freedom. The need for that little space up there, the I part, to expand a little bit. Just a little.
Just a little.
Just a little.
The socialism that could engage with the yearnings and dreamings
In Miles Davis music.
an aesthetic dimension.
Radically incompatible with everyday life under capitalism.
Hey, hi everyone, welcome to the first Acid Left podcast, part of the wider Acid Left community and platforms. I'm here with Adam Ray Adkins, my co-host, and Eliot Rosenstock. So passing you over to Adam now. Remember to sign up to our Facebook, The Acid Left, our Instagram, The Acid Left, and our Patreon, Patreon/Acid Left, where you can subscribe for as little as $3 to get exclusive tuition videos, memes, articles, reviews, sections of books that are upcoming, and much, much more, including original Acid Left artwork. So I'm passing over, without further ado, to Adam Ray Adkins, aka Dirt Son of Earth. Take it away, Dirt.
Eliot wrote the Zero Books title Zizek in the Clinic, a revolutionary proposal for a new endgame in psychotherapy. He is a practicing psychotherapist, and he runs the Sigmund Freud Dank Meme Stash on Facebook, which is a very active group. Eliot,
and a million other Facebook. So the Freud one, and then for some reason I got made an admin of this page, which is actually larger than the group, which is just music. It's kind of funny. And
that's great.
Facebook's like a whole other world. That's like a whole second conversation.
It is. Facebook is a strange place.
Yeah.
But Eliot, I kind of wanted to jump right into this and kind of go over your book a little bit. Your first book. I know you're writing a new one now, but for some of the people that may not have read it or may not be familiar with your ideas, this book is like outlining the tools that you use as a psychotherapist that are kind of derived from Zizek. But you also go through these dominant schools of cognitive psychotherapy and like the behavioralist model, and you take them to task for ignoring or abandoning the unconscious. It seems that the danger you see in the models such as CBT is that they do work, but they only relieve this symptom and tend to ignore the root cause. Is that correct?
Work is a very strange word because you have to define the object of psychotherapy first. And I think CBT works in a very sort of pragmatic way. So one of the rules of official sort of state-sanctioned work, which I take part in, is when you do something, it has to be understandable to somebody who is untrained, essentially. And you have to explain it to somebody who has no training in psychotherapy. So that has a kind of limit about what you can do. And it also has a limit about what is state-sanctioned, because what is state-sanctioned also has to be understood with no training. So imagine something like trying to design a rocket ship, but with the parameters of no one who's studied. This has to be understandable to someone who doesn't understand rockets or anything like that. I mean, I'm sure someone could provide a half-baked explanation, but you would never ask a rocket scientist to do something like that. But the problem with psychotherapy and psychology in general is it's a kind of fluid notion of general mental health. So that can be reterritorialized by capital very easily, and you can cite productivity. You can cite sort of these basic pragmatic life issues, and reducing those pragmatic life issues, or at least in the response of the client, to you saying that they are reduced, and that can be your end goal for psychotherapy. And then what I sort of posited is, well, there's a whole history of the mind, or philosophy of the mind, and there's the tradition of psychoanalysis, and it's a sort of how-to guide to essentially subvert the state. Like entirely. That's, it's a bit of, Zizek in the clinic. It's Zizek insofar as you're examining the structural ideology of the thing, but I don't think Zizek would agree with the subversion of the state, because he is a quite, classical Leninist in a lot of ways. But I sort of took Zizek's model of examining ideology and sort of put it to the therapy profession, and to sort of crack it open a bit, and to lay out what could be done about the tendency of capital's reterritorialization to degrade the quality of psychotherapy in general. So that was the project, essentially, and it's still the project.
And and one of the things I really like about the book is, I think it is funny and it's interesting to see Zizek use this way, because he's kind of like against psychotherapy in a way. Like, I don't think he could ever imagine his work being used in this way.
He liked it at the time. I don't think I think the more the diremption between me and him appears in general ideology, I think I think he will tend to move away from any project like this. I think initially he was supportive, and he said he was very happy that he wrote it, but now in terms of my new direction of egoism and the sort of solid egoist ethic, even with his sort of initial enjoyment of Ayn Rand, he wants, he's going to be distant from that project, certainly. So yeah, it's a different ideology, but nonetheless, Zizek, and one of the things you sort of asked me beforehand, in terms of maybe something we can get more into, is why Zizek and not simply Lacan or Hegel, right? And I think Zizek, yeah, and Zizek does a good he does a good job of sort of, quote unquote, inventing the symptom, you could say, where Lacan would sort of always point to the imaginary quality of it, and Hegel would, of course, always point to the quality of right, and the differences, Hegel in the multipolar world, like Dugin and China now, you could say. But yeah, Zizek would sort of diagnose the structure and sort of, reveal the dictatorship within democracy, you could say, or the dictatorship within, or the ideology within what supposedly has no ideology. Your pseudo escape from ideology, which is actually a very specific sort of set of rules that you have to follow.
Yeah, that's to me one of the biggest insights I've gained from Zizek as well. I also really have taken to Zizek's idea that the unconscious is not a space, like not under the conscious mind, but the very folding or topology of the mind itself. Is that the way that you understand the unconscious as well in your project?
To a certain extent, I outline it differently in terms of, I sort of think a lot about the will as a sort of negative space, in contrast with demand, which is the sort of articulated positive space, that's what I'm sort of writing about now. So I sort of stay away from essentially revealing the topology of no inside outside as if I've found it. And what I try to focus on is what does the articulation of words mean? What are the consequences of the demand articulations that we make to each other? So I would say a bit of a different way I use Lacan. It's a very you could say it's a very idiosyncratic read of Lacan. So I don't think you could like refer to the Klein bottle and then refer to my project and sort of mash two and two together, because I do try to, once again, you could say invent the symptom a little bit in the sort of Zizekian style and try to map out what sort of is the real nature of the unconscious, the sort of totalizing unconscious will and, unarticulated space, the virtual space of the sort of, where Zizek posits there's nothing People, the project is to sort of create an anti-biological or anti-Freudian biological view, and sort of posit the self as a sort of virtual nothing, which is kind of true, but also, if you read Freud, it's, very against his project, and Lacan critiqued Freud quite a bit, but to return back to Freud, that there is a sort of singular determinate unconscious, which can escape itself and then create logics and systems, which you don't necessarily have to go to the Freudian molecule. You can look at sort of the rule sets in the symbolic order itself and approach it through that way. And that's why it's a sort of psychodynamic cognitive approach. Hopefully I haven't lost you just droning on, but
I might just come in now.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I was lost or not. I guess, I mean, it's a whole language, no, Lacan. I haven't really looked into it much. I mean, I did read some Freud in my 20s, which is some time ago now, and Jung, who I think maybe you're not a big fan of. Lacan I touched upon, but I kind of ended up throwing the book out of the window. It was that unintelligible. I guess one either has enough time in life to get ahead completely around Lacan or Adorno, but not both. And
yeah, sure.
But I have had causes to want to be, should we say, treated? Is that a good word? To want to be made to feel better, by people in the analytic or psychotherapeutic professions. And I just kind of wonder, because I wonder really at the end game of the analyst or therapist, and what the end game of the patient should be, because to my mind, just feeling better ought to be something in itself, and that is something that I think you even yourself say in your first book, Zizek in the Clinic. CBT can work. These things work. The end of wanting to feel better and doing it through simple kind of ABC processes is finding.
Well, the problem is it registers as feeling better, and it sort of registers in a certain way. But the problem is, if the Freudian hypothesis is correct, and you simply paint over initial trauma with a sort of cognitive process, there's a limit to quote unquote feeling better.
Yeah, I can see that, and I can see the kind of need to maybe go deeper and go through a full process of analysis, such you kind of get to the core of the problem. I don't know the exact terms, but then I seem to remember from Lacan and Freud this kind of idea that you would never really eradicate the suffering, that you would end up coming to terms with the kind of the immovable stain or inner core. Then I think, well, okay, so why would I do that? Not to be antagonistic, but what is one supposed to feel at the end of several years of therapy?
I mean, you can use the current model of distress in terms of what is your level of distress. And I think if one looks at one's own life, I think you can point to, I mean, I certainly can, maybe I'm projecting here, but times where your distress level was much higher on a day-to-day basis than it is currently. Maybe right now it's much higher. I don't know. But I certainly can.
Yeah, I can relate to that. So you want to get that as far down as possible consistently, I guess, because, we know, if you've been alive some decades, that there are peaks and troughs, but you don't want to sustain troughs. So the
other thing about psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, rather than sort of quote unquote figuring it out yourself, and this is very apparent to me in quote unquote self-analysis, which some say is impossible, but basic logics of contradiction within one's own psyche can be very difficult to approach by oneself.
I would totally agree with that. Yeah, I can quite see how that would be an issue. I suppose the other question I would have is that given the kind of role, I don't know to what extent you agree with this. I say in Zizek in the Clinic, I got the impression you did, but with your next book, I think, are you writing it now, or are you finished the next book coming out from zero?
It's just about finished, and
Okay, I'm
it's
not sure
I
if
told Doug it would be finished on the 5th, and I also told him it'd be finished in June.
Okay.
Also said it'll be finished in May. But we're at 25,000 out of 30,000 words, and I've deleted quite a bit. So
Okay.
I want to get this one kind of very solidly correct and easy to follow.
Sure. It looks interesting, but I'm just wondering whether you've changed your stance slightly. But I think in Zizek in the clinic, you were broadly going along with Fisher. If you didn't say that specifically, but with Mark Fisher's take that, you know, capitalism has some kind of negative impact on our psychological stability, if I'm not wrong. And I would totally agree with that. But, you know, to what extent is therapy somehow part of the capitalist system? I mean, this is something that
it certainly is.
Yeah,
and I'm talking about
in TV accounts of therapists, you always get this kind of comedy therapist that is kind of like, well, hey, why don't you come next week on a retreat I have planned? You know, I think you could do with a retreat. Bring your wife; it will be €200 a head. You know, it's always this kind of thing. And I wondered how that is dealt with by the analytical profession or therapy.
I mean, I'm very straightforward. I like say my price, and then, you know, I'm not very nice about it either. But in terms of reterritorialization by capital, there is the question, and you hear of Lacan's story of essentially like, how much money you got on you? Here, just give me whatever you got. And then he throws it in a big drawer. I try to stay away from the totalitarian capital model of like, oh yeah, you know, pay whenever, and like sort of chatting someone up. I said, look, it's like this. And if someone like tries to chat me up more who's like interested in services, I'm like, hey, look, if you want, I'm like, this is the price. Okay. I'm like, and I understand if you think I'm rude and don't want to have services with me, that's fine as well. But so I try not to finagle retreats. I try not to finagle retreats out of people. But I think people who, I guess, look for therapy services and then find that it's been so recaptured by capital rather than the object in itself. You have to figure out what is determining it. And if you go to, say, China, you won't find such a capitalist system, but what you will find, interestingly enough, is a huge behavioral model where people are inventing the symptom, and there's such an emphasis on what sort of, I guess, degeneracy one has, and then how to fix it, right? Behaviorally, so that they function well in society. So there's this big question of ideology in general when it does come to psychotherapy. And I, you know, you could say I have a very, you know, I guess not anti-state, but I try to at least reveal the power structure between the therapist and the client. One, two, have the therapist not disavow that there is a power structure between the therapist and client, and that revealing comes through the therapist does have a certain expertise, and then what should the expertise do, and how should it function with the client's sort of signifiers that they bring, and how should the therapist essentially reveal what you could call absolute contradictions in structure and psyche, and the way that gets sublated by the client is, you know, up to the client. So I try to outline this way to escape the reterritorialization by sort of capital within the psychotherapy profession as much as I can, right? So I try to define the object of mental health structurally, sort of based on its own sort of principles and structure, which includes that, you know, in America, we're very big on disavowing that the therapist has any expertise. But what's the one problem with that? If you disavow that you have power, then power just works invisibly, right? And if therapy is a process of revealing, and you have this invisible process of power and ideology, then exactly how much are you going to uncover in therapy? So there's all these problems. There's all these problems, not just in capital's reterritorialization of therapy, but in therapy itself, and the sort of space that therapy lends towards prescriptivist models that are based on the therapist's own ideology, which could be, you know, American or Chinese or whatever, and sort of how to overcome that. So yes, capital's reterritorialization, but also freeing the virtual object of mental health, you could say, as well.
Well, I think that gives us a good segue. And Mike touched on it a little bit too. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of like Fisher's ideas, because I think I can't recall where, but I think in a podcast I heard or an interview with you, you kind of pushed back on Fisher a bit. So Mark Fisher described what he called the privatization of mental health in several of
Yes.
his books.
Yeah.
It's this problem where personal issues or where problems are seen as personal issues or bad brain chemistry, like, oh, brain don't work right, and larger societal issues that could have causal links to individual mental health are kind of dismissed. Capital's not seen as an influence. And I think we also see this approach in some of the works like The Authoritarian Personality, which was edited by Adorno. You see it in like The Sane Society from Eric Fromm, and then even in Jungians like James Hillman. So what are your thoughts on applying psychoanalysis to structures larger than individuals? The socioanalysis that
I think it's
I
good.
think Fromm. You do? Okay. You do.
So insofar as I push back on quote unquote push back on Fisher, I would say I push back on the total disavowal of individual agency, and I'm sort of you could say a vulgar humanist and this existentialist humanist like Sartre, condemned to be free. We don't choose the conditions, but nonetheless there is a role of will. But people typically miss in the direction of privatization of mental health illness. So I'm literally arguing the point that I'm supposedly against in that question yesterday, in terms of I'm trying to argue that the basic socialist idea that man must eat, have shelter, before you sort of psychologize. And then they're like, well, why did you decide that? Who are you to decide that? Right? So that's the question my supervisor would ask me, in terms of, who are you to decide that taking care of in case management is more important than psychology, right? Or mental health. And I said, well, you asked that question to me, but nonetheless, that question posits the opposite, that psychology is more important than food and shelter. And that's what I'm trying to reveal, which is this tendency of psychotherapy to do this constantly, which is disavow their own position, which is steeped in ideology. Through that questioning, it's like, well, who are you to determine housing and food and shelter is Trump's psychology? And I say, well, who are you to ask me that? You could say, why is that not immediately accepted? And then what are you trying to achieve by asking that question to me? Are you trying to, focus on these other aspects? But, I'm lucky enough that I can actually work on all of that and bill it through the state. But, and I'll determine if someone needs these sort of basic life things more so than, neuroses untangled. So I'm in a position currently where I can tackle that, but that's not always the case if you go into private mental health, of course. But if you go in state sanctioned mental health, that's what you'll find, which there is this battle between what is personal and what is societal. And, the attitude is that everything's personal. Right. That's the general attitude. And we even have psyops post up. It says, you can have results or excuses, but not both, stuff like that. Like all these various things that are quote unquote will based, in terms of everything's personalized. It's like, you just gotta, stop complaining and take on the task. But the problem is, you quote unquote stop complaining, you no longer identify what you really need to address. And a lot of times that will be, homelessness, work, shelter. And, I'm most proud of myself when, you have a client who doesn't have a job or can't get work. And then I can do psychotherapy and case management to the point where they get their first job they've ever had, or someone who's homeless, or someone who's in a domestic violence situation in extraordinarily poor, extraordinarily violent areas, and I can actually get them out. So insofar as I'm a decent person, I would say that's my own, that's the only thing I would cite.
Okay, yeah.
In terms of my technical skill to do this. So I would say systemically, I believe in systemic intervention, right? I'm not one of those who psychologizes purely, but to a certain extent, there is a psychological aspect. But then sometimes the psychological aspect is identifying these things which are outside, which is partly it's like it's the consciousness in the world, you could say.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect answer. Because it can go.
It's a perfect answer
too
that
much in the
lacks
other
nothing. Oh, I did it. I overcame the lack. Excellent.
Yeah, or at least bridge the gap.
That's one time.
So, well, okay. So then, we talked a lot about, or in our pre-questions about psychedelic experiences or psychedelic psychoactive chemicals. We've seen this.
Oh, now we're getting into it. Okay.
Yeah, let's get into that because I think
you left podcast after all.
Yeah, and we're on various levels there. I think I am more on the side of this kind of thing where I think Mike may not be, and I think you have like a very
to clarify this.
conflicted
I
stance.
just in my defense there, because I won't say that I'm not on the side of psychedelics. It would be kind of bizarre of me to be against psychedelics as such. I just don't do any now. I have done them in my life. I don't do anything right now. Incidentally, I'm kind of what you call a straight edge, straight edge hardcore. I don't drink even. I don't even drink coffee or tea.
Wow, Mormon straight edge.
Yeah, but it's kind of only because I don't drink the most kind of clean of anyone I know. But I mean,
you get all your drugs from the internet.
Yeah, I get high on life. I get high on internet life.
The virtual is a hell of a drug.
But I just wanted to come in there, rather to come in to finish. I think there are myriad ways of experiencing what you experience on acid. Not quite the same thing, but I guess what one gets on acid that you also get through meditation, for example, is a blurring of the kind of false boundary of subject and object. And you no longer feel this lack of or this fear of the object or lack of, because you're kind of not able to unify with the object or kind of reach back to your feeling of oneness with everything in the womb. So I wanted Eliot to maybe say something on that. Like, do you see a kind of parallel between spiritual experience and psychedelic experience?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many different experiences one can have when one ingests a chemical of some kind. You can have a spiritual experience. It sounds like you had the experience similar to William James, the American pragmatist, who took nitrous, and he said he understood through his whole body. He understood that Hegelianism was true after he did a whole non-Hegelian system, of course.
Yeah, I had that on mushrooms, but I also think when you get lost looking at a work of art or listening to a piece of music, you might experience this kind of like, loss of the boundaries, and you're suddenly floating. You're no longer kind of aware of being different from the world, different from the surrounding world, from nature.
Yeah. Well, I sort of think in the same existentialist vein, like objectively, that we are, I don't quite agree with this Zizekian hypothesis that we think there is something, we think there is an I, but there really is nothing. Just insofar as Freudian psychology is correct in terms of there is a sort of unconscious, which from this sort of you could say in the Zizekian sense, the positively charged nothingness from which something comes. And if there's a nothingness, as Badiou shows all the names, as Badiou shows us, there's a sign of the nothing. And then if there's a sign of the nothing, then nothing is positively charged. And what is the charge? Not quite nothing. Well, that's the unconscious, the sort of primordial soup from which things emerge. So I would say there is a self, even if the self lacks and is imaginary and has all these tenuous properties, as Lacan outlines very well. And then there is it easily is dissolved, or it's dissolved through analysis. It's dissolved through it, analyzing the contradiction and then reformed. And I think, you know, LSD can do that, or any psychedelic could do that, you know, and depending on what one is, you know, doing. Then there's the cybernetic loops, you could say, of substance use, which people get into.
Yeah, so
a bit different.
I think I started.
Go on. Oh, you cut out. I cannot hear
Hello?
you. Hi, now
Hello?
I can hear you.
Okay. I started with when I was younger in a heavy belief in some of the like psychedelia stuff, like influenced by Terrence McKenna and Timothy Leary, reading all that when I was in high school and getting out and experimenting with it. And then I got into reading more philosophy and psychoanalysis, reading Freud and Zizek. And I stepped away from that, and then in recent years have come back to some of those beliefs, but I've been kind of dismayed at the way psychedelics have been folded into the therapy session. I think they could absolutely have therapeutic
Yeah.
benefits. I think we see this even on like a material level of reconnecting neurons.
Yeah. Well, it's
I'm
certainly
not a
not
brain scientist.
necessarily
I don't know what that
leftist.
means.
I want to like emphasize this. Like the person who I know, who's most interested into integrating psychedelics into psychotherapy proper, I would say, is apolitical to kind of reactionary. And they, you know, they're a licensed therapist. So there's nothing intrinsically you could say leftist about it. I think you can say maybe there is, in terms of there might be elements of critique which are within it, but yeah, I think psychedelics being integrated into psychotherapy is happening more and more, but there's a limit in terms of, you know, when a you know, random Joe Schmo comes to you, you can't be like, try some acid. You know?
Yeah, it's not going to fix it.
So it's a specialized branch of psychotherapy for sure, which is existent, if not totalizing, you could say.
Yeah. Do you think it could have those benefits outside of like the clinical setting, or is it confined to the clinical setting?
I would say outside the clinical setting, it falls under the domain of life.
Yeah.
You know, you're living, you take a psychedelic, your ego gets, you know, blasted away. You start to understand Camel Crush cigarettes as intrinsically cheap and evil. But another brand is good. This was my own personal experience in college. I was like, what a cheap, evil cigarette. So LSD doesn't always give you great insights, but it's certainly, I think, I haven't done LSD since I started studying philosophy more seriously. And that's, you know, I think I might have experience that I do kind of comprehend is showing me other things, but that's all substances. They have that potential. You know, the one time when I was, you know, I think 21, 22, and I just did a lot of coke. Before I read Freud, I had the same insight that Freud had, which was everything was sublimated sexuality, in terms of I could quote unquote hear in people's sentences the sort of sublimated sexual context of their own sexual neuroses. And I hadn't read Freud at all. And then suddenly I heard it and I couldn't unhear it. And now I recognize that is something that needs to be reality tested. But at first it was very terrifying. So yes, psychedelics can open doors, and sometimes it leaves you on a precipice that is terrifying. So you never quite know what a psychedelic will do to you. You can turn your back on a person, but you can't turn your back on a drug.
Due to some technical issues, we have lost a small portion of this audio section.
We've lost the most insightful, cutting portion. Oh God, if you only knew what you've missed. That's how I'd do it.
No, that's it. We got it now.
Yeah. Oh boy. Well, as just to sum up, as Adam and Mike, you were saying, Mike was telling everyone about sobriety and life being trippy sort of on its own, and the sort of in-your-faceness that sobriety gives. And Adam was talking about psychedelic usage and its unity with the psychotherapy profession. And I was basically arguing for this Hegelian read of reality, where you really do have to, there is a sort of individual sort of Freudian unconscious where there's this tenuous ego which posits itself, and that its basis is in history, in individual history, and then there's a sort of absolute contradiction, which is Hegel's main posit, is sort of this absolute contradiction which exists between pro-psychedelic use and the medical model of drug abuse, right? And that's felt by the people who are dealing with this question of psychedelic use. Like, this is the Acid Left podcast. So this is towards the pro-psychedelic use side, you could say. But it's not, it doesn't escape the medicalization of the idea of drug abuse, right? And that sort of causes something that would have to be overcome to a certain extent by people on the pro-psychedelia side, or even the sobriety side. It's overcome in various ways, in individual history ways which relate to one's individual history to a certain extent. And then you can also do that systemically in terms of how are we going to take this system and cope with this absolute contradiction of ideal between this medicalization and this pro-psychedelia angle, right?
Yeah.
So, okay.
Adam, is Adam even here? Is he just like...
Yeah, no, I'm here.
Just like so upset that I didn't record that 15 minutes.
No, it's good. That missing gap is it's very important. So, yeah, I'm not even sure I believe in a completely sober life, unless you're trying to... I've just been thinking about that through what Eliot was saying, and unless you're embracing some kind of like ascetic, like denial of life, I kind of agree with Robert Anton Wilson, where a potato is as psychedelic as a tab of LSD. Everything we're consuming is doing this, and today with the way media and the internet's affecting our consciousness, it's hard to think of, even when I have ingested no substances, which is quite often. I don't want to present myself as someone who's always tripping or anything. That's far from the case. But yeah, I find myself never feeling in a quite sober state of mind. Always under attack from different stimulus.
Always doomed to your material self to a certain extent.
Yes.
Eating a potato, like you said. One must eat and drink. Certainly LSD has a greater ability to jettison out of one sort of...
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But that consciousness is just affected like by all of the other social relations I'm thrust upon into. So I'm trying to think of what to talk about now.
Yeah, interesting actually, just going into what you're saying about one never being sober, and it's something we actually lost in some of the footage we've just lost. I kind of touched upon that. Already, but just how many times in my life I think I've come up on drugs without taking any. That's interesting. I don't know what that really signals, but you get the kind of body rush or mind rush you get when you've taken speed or pills. I won't say ever hallucinating. That's a different thing. Although people do obviously hallucinate without taking drugs.
Yeah,
it's interesting how...
You know what I noticed about stopping taking substances like LSD is suddenly I stopped taking it and I ended up around it much more. Strangely enough, like suddenly I was exposed to like these large quantities of like certain substances, because it's like, oh, this guy doesn't want any of this, so
Yeah, there's the experience of well, actually, that sounds like the law of attraction, which is like, you know, this kind of very woolly, quasi-spiritual, you know, new age spiritual idea. There's this program. Is it called The Secret? It's now on
Yeah,
Netflix.
but it's almost the opposite of The Secret, hilariously
Oh, so it's
enough.
out of what you don't want suddenly starts appearing, but you're still thinking about it. So,
Sure.
but I don't think that really functions like that. But that's just what.
God, do they love The Secret in my clinic?
Yeah. But
Love it.
where was I? But
Everyone
one
loves The
thing I tell you
Secret.
one
It's
thing is
awful.
that how often one gets a hangover when they don't drink, and you realise that actually a lot of symptoms of hangovers are not actually drinking. So it is interesting just how much off our heads we are, even when we're not.
Sure. But then, yeah, I mean, to posit a normal state of consciousness. Because I would say when I feel normal, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling kind of energized. I'm feeling sober. And I would say that's a kind of normal state, but it's also a good state. So I wouldn't posit feeling like kind of normal, even though that might be more quantitatively normal for me sometimes, depending.
Yeah, I would tend to agree there. It does seem more quantitatively normal. I mean, you feel all sorts of things when you're under no substances, by far. And then if, you know, we want to think of something even as benign as like sugar as a substance and how much that affects uh, individuals and larger cultures, I mean, that would be quite a bit, I would say.
Sure. I suppose there's a question here of when is one taking drugs, and is it worth bifurcating? I think there's certainly the idea of bifurcation, and then there's, which I think why you'll sort of lose a lot of Deleuzian types in Lacanian thought, or why certain people don't like how I approach things, you could say, who are into more of the anti-structural approaches, are in terms of I'll run with the idea that there is a sort of diremption out there, or a diremption in the symbolic order between substances and food, you could say, or sugar, right? And then you have to look, you can go back to Trotsky. Let's look at Trotsky, since this is the Acid Left podcast, in terms of what is the quantitative shift in your day-to-day consciousness, which creates a qualitative categorical shift. And you could look at drugs as something which produces enough of a shift from your day-to-day sobriety or food or water-based sort of operation. I'm not one for the dissolving of the unity of that sort of idea, I think, like, there's no point in me chauvinistically saying that, like, which I am doing. I'm sort of like chauvinistically imposing this bifurcation on you, in terms of like, yeah, why is it different? I think for my own, like I said, my own individual history, yeah, it goes back to that. For my own individual history, I need to bifurcate such things. And for your individual history and where you want to go in the future, a unity is possible between, you could say, food and drugs or something like that. So you can't really escape your individual history or your needs or your egoism,
Right.
one's own self-interest, right?
Yeah. And even myself, I have a hierarchy of chemicals or substances. There are some that I feel are completely unhelpful, or unhelpful enough to the point where they should be avoided because their helpfulness is so little. And I would categorize alcohol into that, which is one of the most widely consumed drugs in the world. So that's a weird position to be in.
What, that alcohol is bad?
Yeah, I think alcohol is awful. I think it is awful on the physical and mental body.
It can kill you.
And I mean, I think a lot of people obviously agree with that, but they continue to ingest it, and its acceptance is so wide that it's like people will say, "Oh, well, yeah, of course you shouldn't be drunk all the time," but
Yeah, but I mean, I go along a bit with the straight edge mentality. I mean, I'm not only say straight edge joking, and I find the movement quite funny, but I go along a lot with the idea. I think Henry Rollins has said it in a few interviews, that drink just keeps people stupid, and governments are so happy to have like drink legal in the West.
You mind if I take a pro cigarettes and alcohol position here? Just for this, I'm going to take the pro cigarettes and alcohol position. Smoke and drink. No, but really, in terms of this, is once again we get to the question of ideal in the world, and what are you going to have ideal? What are your ideals? And in what system is cigarettes and alcohol good? And you could say in a day-to-day, if you're at a bar with other people who use cigarettes and alcohol, with the peer pressure, right? You could say it's a good situation, right?
Yeah, because absolutely, if I
it's
well, I was gonna say, if I go to a bar and refuse those things that are there, I have like automatically placed myself as an outsider. And the social lubrication that alcohol can provide is a great way of talking to people, in very small amounts. It's a great icebreaker. You share some kind of cultural thing. Your inhibitions are lowered. You're having a good time with the boys.
Sure.
So there is that.
There's positives, but I'm almost talking about it's just its general functionality. Like you get to the point where it's obviously like, say, like Hemingway, where his liver's popping out of his shirt while he's taking drinks. And it's still good for him, you could say. It depends on your individual historical ideals. And then when you are in power, though, should Hemingway impose his ideal of alcohol on the world? Probably not. Probably not good to. I wouldn't trust Ernest Hemingway with alcohol policy, you could say. And then psychedelic policy, I think I'm definitely for a re-examination of it, but don't underestimate where the real shift would occur, which is within that social order, which is not necessarily related to the psychedelic property itself, but the legalization of, say, LSD or mushrooms within a place like, say, where I live, Los Angeles. It would have profound effects on the social order, whether or not you're on it. Two people not on it, the fact that one could be on it or one could buy it has profound effects. Even you could say marijuana legalization has already had that to a certain degree. I work in therapy, the therapy profession, and there's certain services, and if you bring up marijuana use, I'm happy to report that they'll say, so what, it's legal. Like, fuck you. Like the state police apparatuses will act. That's the official position now. So that's very interesting, right? And who knows, like those sorts of what would occur with the state once psychedelics were legal. You'd be very interesting. And you already see it in the army to a certain extent, in terms of you can't drug test for psychedelics. And I just saw that suddenly they're testing for LSD because LSD became a big thing for soldiers to take. And there were people busted in Japan for selling LSD because they could take LSD and it wouldn't show up on tests, although now they're testing more and they're figuring out ways to bust people for LSD usage in the U.S. Army or Navy or whatever. Wow. You know what I mean.
I was unaware of this, and it does seem kind of frightening to me to imagine a lot of soldiers.
Like the idea of U.S.
LSD.
troops on acid?
No, not particularly, though I could see some appeal to it. And like
maybe
also,
they'll be the
that's
Buddhist soldiers,
too.
the drone soldiers, it is nothing to drone strike. So easy.
Yeah, but also it's interesting to think of that because the history of psychedelics becoming illegal is directly tied to the social movements of the 1960s. They couldn't make protesting illegal, so they kind of cracked down on cannabis, on LSD, on all these things. And I don't think it's necessarily because they saw it as the use of it as a threat, but the connection of the use of it to left countercultures.
Well, also follow the bread. That's my favorite paranoid psychotic thing to say. Follow the breadcrumbs, and you'll find that originated in the United States government having an interest in it as well. So it's not like it suddenly appeared in counterculture. It was sort of defined as a perverse enjoyment prior in the United States government itself prior to its counterculture use, which is kind of interesting. How that works dialectically in terms of it's predetermined that this is going to be bad think, which determines its usage. And I think there's a sort of hidden desire of the United States workers to propagate these things which are officially bad. I think, keep an eye on the government doing that, because as Margaret Thatcher, our favorite communist, just kidding, said, governments are people. And who said that shit? Margaret Thatcher didn't say that. Governments are individuals. But the problem with dismissing that is that, yes, governments are individuals, which means that there are people in the government who are very high in the government who have, they're just as interested in these cultural wars that we are. And the fact of the matter is they're not past expanding something which is officially bad just because they want to see it in the world. Like, you can even look at the crack epidemic. It's like, crack is new. let's ship it into like underprivileged neighborhoods. You could even say it's like, well, that's specifically undermining the Black community, but it's also a representation of the sort of desire to have this sort of new drug experience, which turns into the other enjoying for the United States government. It gets very complicated, but I wouldn't say you're not free of dialectics, let's just say, when you do discover the counterculture, because it might have been predetermined dialectically. You're still part of the Geist, you could say. Is the terrifying Zizekian idea, of course, which I'm repeating here, which is how counter is your counterculture.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think I just had one last question for you, Eliot, and it's a silly one.
I'm ready.
Well, also, if you wanted to mention anything, if you wanted that you wanted people to check out, but also, what chemical with what philosopher would you choose to take?
What chemical with what philosopher?
Yeah, like, are you gonna do nitrous with Schopenhauer, or?
Can I just interject and say that because you were taking your time, I would take antidepressants with Walter Benjamin just before he killed himself, so that he didn't.
Oh, Jesus.
Now go ahead, Eliot.
Quite an answer. I was gonna say, now my answer seems fucking ridiculous, because now I gotta think of the moral implications with that. So I was gonna say, like, well, I'd probably have champagne. I'd probably have alcohol with Kant, because I know he specifically has a dinner party set up. Hegel would be very curmudgeonly and probably wouldn't want to talk with me. I think Kant is like a bit of a, he's a bit more social than Hegel. So I think I'd rather have drinks with Kant than Hegel, even though I'm more Hegelian than Kantian, because I know meeting one's heroes is not necessarily a good thing. But now that you say that, Mike, Jesus.
Yeah. Well,
maybe MDMA with Mark Fisher,
Yeah,
there you go.
We should
right? How about that?
Go back and meet all of the philosophers who killed themselves and take. And
I would do MDMA therapy with Mark Fisher, sure. I've had that thought. I was like, if David Foster Wallace had me as a therapist, I wonder what would have happened. You never know, because people that are very intelligent are often so insistent on their symptom. It can be very difficult when you're dealing with these sort of intellectual forces when they have a particular symptom. Although I've had success psyoping intellectuals out of their symptomatic, I think, personally. Not on, I wouldn't say I did this personally, but I know that myself and Brian Francis Culkin were very much interested in making John David Ebert stop calling his ex a whore who's dead, and he did. So
well, that's great.
Successful psyop question? No, of course, he did it all on his own.
Well, we were actually thinking of making like the family tree of kind of people on the left, but really I think around zero books who have worked together, who have collaborated, but also who have fallen out with each other. And then I thought also that we could, just having you having said that, I think we could also like refer half of them to therapy.
Sure.
With you.
Sure. I mean, I would be a life coach, since I would never dream of practicing psychotherapy outside the realm of the great state of California, which is where I'm registered and soon to be licensed, you could say, to see clients. But I'm always taking life coach people, which is working through problems, identifying contradictions, and working through them. Life coaching. Anyway.
All right.
Sounds good, and a great talk.
Yeah.
Adam, were you going to say something to finish up, to cap that off?
No, I think we should all take LSD and go through a walk on the woods and while on a call with Eliot so he can life coach us. I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Eliot.
Yeah, absolutely.